Good morning, everybody, and thank you for everyone who's stayed on this. I'm going to talk through restorative justice, but the reality of it is I think it will marry into the conversations we've already heard from Hamza and from Graham and from Karen, and hopefully will resonate with what I think is the challenge from a practitioner level in terms of the justice system. Before I kick off, I'd just like to reflect to everyone the page you're seeing at the moment is a new branding, which we've just started this year. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you see the thread as we go through this presentation. If you go to the next slide for me. And just bounce through, I think everyone knows who I am now. So Karen touched on it earlier about the number of reviews and work groups and policies that are coming through. But recently the Scottish Government started to look again at restorative justice and set up a task force and have come out with an action plan. And I've just captured there just to give the background to this work that's been underway. What I would reflect is we were going to have this conference a wee while back, and the world has moved on, especially in terms of pandemic since then. But if you look at it around what are they talking about with restorative justice, and given a definition here, and looking at that facilitated contact, looking at victim and person who's harmed. And one of the things that's been a thread, I think, through this morning, for me, has been the use of language. And when we want to take people with us, we have to be careful about the language we use. So when I've been in work groups and we've talked about smart justice, I think that sometimes misses the emotion that people are looking for, because they're looking for justice, and the smart sometimes distracts. But here, what I would reflect in restorative justice is we talk about victims and we talk about harm. And it takes us into a discussion around the use of criminal language and the use of perhaps welfare language. In terms of then the Scottish Government Action Plan, we're looking at restorative justice available across Scotland. So it takes us into another space then around consistency. And one of the things that we touched on earlier, and the Minister brought it up around, were representatives of the judiciary. One of the challenges that we face as a practitioner is different perspectives and different interpretations depending on which locality you're in. So poverty is an issue, and I'll come back to poverty as we go through it, but actually locality is also an issue. And I think we need to think through that. So if you can move on to the next slide. For anyone who wants to see it, I've left a link there in terms of the action plan. And one of the things that I'll come to challenge around it in terms of that again is this language use around justice language, such as victims, and then perhaps restorative language, such as communities, but also perhaps our ambition that says by 2023, and I think I'll challenge that ambition. You go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the process itself, I don't think there's anything there that you wouldn't expect and hope. I think one of the real powers of restorative justice is it looks forwards as much as it looks backwards. And when we get to talk about what the nature of our society is, and especially at the moment, it's quite hard to look to the future at the moment. And we keep looking back over what's happened and what are we counting and what we're measuring. A restorative justice process allows us to look forward. It's also not about establishing guilt. Guilt's in one sense already established, if that makes sense, that it's about moving on. It's about taking it forward. It's about how you make and repair and mediate, which for the ones of us of a certain age, I think restorative justice 20 years ago was mediation and reparation, and now we call it restorative justice. So, but for me, it is about that reparation, that mediation. If you could move on to the next one. I always, as a practitioner, cringe a little bit when I see what requirements we get in, because we tend to then put bureaucracy around it. And one of the challenges that we face in a fluid or an agile environment is how much requirements and bureaucracy you put into that. But the reality of it is, if we want consistency, if we want to make it work, if we want it to be perceived as working, if we want to integrate it, then as service providers, we need to really up our game. We need to make sure that it's professional. We need to make sure that it's meaningful. And we need to make sure it's personal to the people that are involved. And I'd reflect for people who were, I think the last Justice Conference that we did, I think one of the challenges I put to the Minister is you have to be careful that there's not always just, as it were, one victim in an offence. Yeah, most of the young people that we work with that might fall into this one will have also been victims themselves. So, you know, we talk about harmed and harm, the harmer and the harmed, that can be quite interchangeable. But in terms of the provider requirements, these are the requirements that providers need. These are the requirements that providers have to adhere to. You can move on to the next slide. In terms of does it work, there's not a lot of research out there. And some of it, as all research tends to do, conflicts. But research by Shapland was a 7-year study that showed a frequency of offending by 14% drop. It said 80% of offenders who took part thought it would lessen their likelihood of reoffending. It saved £7 for every pound spent. So again, as an investment, you know, if you did in an economic sense, I'll give you, you know, a rate of 8 times your return on investment. Why wouldn't you do that? I think one of the things that's maybe not fully understood about restorative justice is that it can deal with a specific problem for a specific people at a specific time. And sometimes it's that, how do you resolve in the moment, that's really important. There is other research out there that mirrors this, maybe not the same exact numbers, but does mirror it. So it is shown to work. If you could go to the next slide for me. Most recent research that I've read was by, and I pronounced this wrong, but Maglione, who it's pretty recent, looked at restorative justice. And I suppose this starts to get for us to that crux of that consistency. So in the research there, only 12 local authorities showed it. The Scottish Government survey in 2018 had 16 responses. So even if I took the 16, and there's some challenge around whether there's a doubling of responses in that, it's still half of the local authorities that across Scotland. So we start at a fairly low base. There's a lack of understanding of restorative justice. There's some research out there that says that the people that you asked knew about it, but actually we've got to be careful. Sometimes we don't research in our own bubble and ask people who, of course, they'll know about it. So I challenge that there's a lack of understanding of restorative justice. And I don't just mean across professionals. This is for me in the wider public and the wider society. And again, I'd take that into some of the language we use. So, you know, we have restorative justice, we have smart justice, we have social justice, we have criminal justice. It's a pretty crowded landscape when we're asking people to understand it. I lead a youth-driven organization, and restorative justice tends to be targeted, I suppose, probably a word I'd use, on young people. And we need to question why. So the minister this morning touched on about young people in prisons and then older people in prisons, and there's perhaps a spectrum there we need to be considering. Challenge for us in terms of referrals, that we look at whole systems approach and early and effective intervention. And what that tends to be, if we're not careful, is that we use restorative justice to deal with what we'd consider the lesser or the earlier criminal acts. Yet research suggests that restorative justice is just as powerful, if not more powerful, in the more serious offences. So we need to just think through when we're using it and why we're using it. Similarly, it's not a standalone intervention. Yeah, it can be, but it doesn't have to be. So again, how do you use this as perhaps a whole package of measures? And for us as an organisation that deals right across that spectrum of care, of justice, of education, of diversion. This would be part of our toolkit that we would develop and use and pick the different areas we need to. It creates some issues for us in terms of local versus central. And I know that the work that the task force has been working on is looking at national hubs and local hubs. But again, you've got a real challenge around in different areas and in different regions, you've got a different approach to it, whether it's a different referral route, whether it's a lack of understanding, or whether it's providers that are in that area, whether it's paid providers, whether it's voluntary providers. So it's a messy landscape. And I'll touch on later, but information sharing and the impact of GDPR, which has become, I would contest now, problematic, not just in terms of restorative justice, but right across the whole justice spectrum for us. And I'm not saying, as it were, the GDPR itself, but the way it's applied and the way that it's being used to, I'll say, make it difficult for us to have a real effective approach to criminal behavior. Go to the next slide, please. In terms of why use it, it reduces offending and supports desistance from crime. It supports recovery from harm. And again, there's research out there. It's a victim-sensitive criminal justice mechanism. I think that's important. But again, I would emphasize that we tend to think of victims, as it were, in the singular, and both parties in this could be victims. And if we want to get a cultural shift, I think the third point, the satisfaction with the justice process, is really important. Yeah, and we need to get away from just that punitive measure. And society-wide might think of punitive measure, but people who tend to be involved in this want to get satisfaction that they have been heard, that their voice has been heard, that there's a reparation that has taken place. Go to the next slide for me. So when and where, for us in terms of adults as an alternative to prosecution, and when we start then talking about how do we stop getting our prisons filled up, then stop prosecuting. For the young people we work with, to divert them from the formal processes, you know, we all know this, one of the biggest indicators of future engagement with the criminal justice system is that initial engagement with the criminal justice system. So if you can divert them from formal processes, then they stand a much better chance going forward. At the point of finding of guilt and the determination of sentence, because for it to work, yeah, you need to be in that place where guilt has been accepted, if that's the right way of putting it. But how do you repair if you don't accept that there was something wrong in the first place? And then similar when a person is in prison or on license following imprisonment. Yeah. So again, it would allow us or enable us to start reducing the prison population and reducing people in the criminal justice system. Which goes right back to what the minister was talking about earlier. How do you save money through the criminal justice system? We'll stop putting people through it all the time. Go from the next slide. So the real challenges that I would say tactically we face. So why isn't it used in all cases? So if you look across other countries, there's a parallel process where you can either go through a restorative process or you can go through a criminal process. I think, again, in the adversarial context, the prevalence is to use it for lesser or less serious crime. Funding, we tend to miss, and we don't get into this, but the reality of it, whatever we might want to do societally, there's a cost to this, and we need to get past this. I think Karen touched on it in her Joe Biden analogy. Yeah, we need to get past this fixed funding. We need to get into a place where, when we say it's the right thing to do, then we find the money to keep doing the right thing. If you look back over the history of restorative justice, started working with it, I would say 20 years ago, called it mediation and reparation, and some good organizations were out there doing some fantastic work. Then the funding disappeared and that work stopped. Or if it didn't stop, it lessened significantly, diminished, I think is probably a good way of reflecting it. We're now back looking, saying, this works, so why are we not doing it? Well, our challenge, one of the reasons we're not doing it is we've not been putting enough funding in there. I think there's a real challenge around, is it centralized or interagency funding? And you can get quite easily caught into, betwixt and between, but there needs to be a real commitment to where that's going to be funded. Going to be an impact in terms of the legislation around under 12s, and we need to think our way through that. I'm not sure 2023 is a really challenging aspiration. I think how we improve data sharing is a huge issue for us. And Richard Lokasangi, so my questions that I've been putting in there, we need to change the language. Language to me is really important, and how we have that conversation is hugely important. And if we want to take the public with us, we need to be aware of that and be really careful. Just because we understand it, that we think that they do too. It's an emotional space to be in. If you can take me to the next slide. I've tried to pull this out to maybe correlate or resonate with some of the debates that we've been going through this morning anyway, and try to think, what really are we talking about here? Yeah, and I think one of the issues we're talking about around justice, and I've used restorative justice there because obviously I'm speaking about restorative justice, but I could take restorative off and just leave justice there, and welfareism. Yeah, and for me, there's an issue around this. So, welfareism for me is about rehabilitation, it's about behavioural change, but it's also about reintegration into community. Yeah, and I think we need to think long and hard of that. I would suggest restorative justice tends to be about the harm and the harmee, as it were. And I'm not sure that's enough. I think as a society, if we believe in rehabilitation, reintegration, behavioural change, then everything, as it were, should be open to restorative justice. And every criminal act should be open to restorative justice. And we should be looking at what works right for us and our society. There's always a philosophical debate around localization and centralization. And I don't just mean here about, who takes responsibility, but you will get variance if you have a localized issue or a localized response. And that might be the right thing. But somewhere, it can't, I think, be a rub of one or t'other. We need to work out a better way about, I don't know, how we localize centralization. Something needs to be there that we work to. Information sharing versus GDPR adherence. I would argue GDPR is not being used, is becoming a blocker for us doing the right thing. And we need to break through that. And we need to make sure that we can have the right conversations for the right people. And I absolutely understand that there are issues around privacy and things, but we're letting a blunt tool stop us from doing the right thing. And we need to work out how we stop doing that. And one of the side effects of doing that is, again, we push people into the justice system or the care system to help them because of GDPR now. And it's not helping them. It's putting them in a system that's going to be a problem for them. There's always an issue for me around policy and practice. So I think if you remember back to one of Karen's slides, there's multiple reviews have gone on. There's multiple thinking going on. There are multiple papers out there. There are acts and there are documents that you could get completely overwhelmed by. Yeah. And there's a lot of policy debates going on, but actually what's happening on the ground and how is it translating to real people, real families? And I'd probably use in here, we get lots of discussions around poverty. Yeah. And we then start saying, well, there's different types of poverty. There's poverty. And we need to be talking about how we holistically, not just through justice, but how we holistically deal with poverty. Because if we can deal with poverty at a holistic level, then we can start dealing with trauma at a holistic level. And we can start dealing with community at a holistic level. And we need to make sure that practice starts to develop. And I don't think it is, and we're not seeing it on the ground, that what we talk about at the policy level is being translated. which then takes you into the huge question. And again, I'm going to refer back to some of the slides that Karen was putting up. Ultimately, isn't that a question, what type of society do we want to be? Yeah, we look at what people do in New Zealand, we look at what they do in Norway, we look at what they do in Australia, or America, England. Ultimately, we need to decide what type of society we want to be. And when we decide what type of society we want to be, then we can work out what we need to do to fund that, what we need to do to make that work, and how that fits together. I think if we're not careful, we're going to try and take the best of everyone, and we'll come up with the best of no one. I think hopefully that should be the last slide for me. I left addendums in there just for any explanation if we share the presentation afterwards, but that's everything from me, Richard. Thanks very much.